Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendy.
So Chuck and Ryan, again, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely. We're going to have some podcast fun today,
yes,
for sure.
Let's chat.
So I know that individually, the two of you have had very different lives. So Ryan, how'd y'all meet?
So Chuck and I had the honor of serving on a national nonprofit board of a fraternal organization that we were both members of when we were in college. And, you know, one of the great parts about it is we never knew each other even existed before coming together in that volunteer space. And although we come from very different backgrounds, the ability to have a common theme to want to serve others and have service on our board, really built at first a professional connection. And then, as you know, over years, when you're in the midst of working on things that mean something to you, we became personal friends and have continued since then.
So you've been friends for a minute.
Just a couple days.
Well, Chuck, I know that, your background is, as you said, Ryan, quite a bit different. I know that, your bio says that you spent over 32 years in the United States Army. So I'm curious, we're going to start talking about leadership here. And I'm curious, when did you know at what point in the military that you're going to be a leader in the military? My guess is you didn't, get in the military and go, I'm going to be a leader in the military. How did you know?
I don't think you ever get to a point where you actually feel comfortable saying I'm a leader. Generally, normally you have a job or a position that will have a leader in its title. But until you validate that through the crucible of having to lead young men and women in the military, you don't really get a frame of reference on what that leadership experience means. You think about it, you're getting a young man or young woman at that point in time, 23 years old, that may have people as old as their parents that are part of their formations. So I think you approach the opportunity for leadership very much as the experience. And then I think what you do is you leave it up to the folks that are part of your formations throughout your career to help define what that leadership actually looks like. It'll vary depending on the units that you have an opportunity to lead. So I don't know that I ever got to a point where I felt comfortable saying, I'm a leader. Well,
and I know before we even hit the record button, Ryan asked you a really great question. And that was, did you consider yourself to be a leader in the military?
I think after a while you do. But I think there's always a balance, and we'll talk about it, I'm sure. Certainly there's a self-awareness piece that you got to be really careful. So what does it mean? If I call myself a leader, is it going to make me any better at what I do, or maybe make me more accountable? So I think at some point in time I understood leadership is not so much it's earned as opposed to being awarded based on a position. And again, the culmination of that over 30 some odd years, I'd like to think that I had opportunities to lead. Sometimes I fell short. I think more times than not, it was a really great experience, born more through the people that I had the opportunity to work with than anything I would have done individually.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. You led us right there. So let's talk about the evolution of leadership. I was thinking about that this morning as we were prepping. And, I graduated from college with a management degree in 1994, business management. And leadership wasn't even a course that was offered. I mean, we were even talking about leadership. And I got a business management degree. So, as we've seen leadership evolve, Ryan, what have you seen out there? How have you seen leadership evolve?
I think there's two aspects to it. I think a large portion of leadership to me is just an intrinsic skill set that develops at a young age. For me, I was a leader of one because nobody in my family ever went to college. And my father was an auto mechanic. My mother cut hair. They scraped by. The church helped us with Christmas. And there were a lot of kind people. But I realized that I wanted something better. So we could classify that as that was my first experience into leadership, was leading my own journey to go somewhere better, to have better opportunities. So I think part of it is you get these opportunities like Chuck was talking about. I think there's a difference between saying you now lead this team, knowing full well that although you're at the head of the table, the person that's really leading things is the guy in the second row on the side of the conference room, because he's the one who's interacting with the team and he's the one who's supporting your initiatives or sabotaging you in the background. I think the other part for me is learning that you have to be a master at following, so that when you assume the reins, you know what the people are doing. And that for me started at a relatively young age. I was in middle school. I decided I wanted to be a newspaper journalist, and that was it. I grew up in East Central Florida. My grandfather worked on the space program since the late 50s, and I was always fascinated by it. And as soon as I was 13 and too tall to ride in the space shuttle and my astronaut career was destroyed, I decided I wanted to be a newspaper reporter. So I was lucky enough to tag along with the two reporters on that beat and ended up working with them for a couple of years. And although I wasn't the leader of that team, I was able to follow and emulate good things to be able to put into practice, 15, 18 years down the road when I was finally helping to set a direction for others.
And he makes a good point too, because the one thing I think what I'm hearing from Ryan as well is that when you're young, the concepts of responsibility and accountability are conflated, right? And the more you age in your leadership experience, you understand you can delegate responsibility. You can't delegate accountability. And that's usually where you get discovered at some point in time. If somebody else is underwriting the risk, that person at the end of the table that Ryan's talking about, chances are your leadership journey's somewhat short-sighted. And I think young people nowadays, and I think you brought up a really good point, is that we don't study leadership. We have the history there, whether you want to talk Sun Tzu or Confucius. Any of the great writers of history would tell you, that the icing on the cake or the great multiplier and enabler is the dynamic leadership that individuals bring to a unit or to an organization.
And that's interesting because I think a lot of it then comes into exposure. Because, for me, I wish I was more contemplative about leadership principles and step 1 and step 2 and step 3. I learned from an early age, not quite fake it till you make it, but you have to be confident in whatever you're doing, because I think confidence instills leadership.
Absolutely.
And because of that, my journey was more of, I'm going to chart the course. And you know what? If I have to turn left or right, I'm not going to crash the car either way, and I'll survive if it's the highway or the scenic route. And then from there, building the experience
Absolutely.
of then more learned practice. But it is amazing to me that as you make a good decision strategically or by luck, and end up in the place to make 2 decisions and then to make 4 decisions and to make 16 decisions. And as it multiplies, the responsibility of becoming more educated and evolved in those processes, because otherwise you're eventually going to get exposed.
Well, and then the most important distinction he made in the earlier narrative, by the way, he's a prolific note taker. That's what attracted to me originally, other than his good looks, was the man and I love that, because people generally that are trying to become better leaders are generally they're self-aware, but they're also very reflective on the things that they do. So I found folks that are prolific note takers are much harder on themselves in the end, but they come out a much better product. So kudos to you.
Hey, I appreciate
but he did mention the whole concept of followership. And I'll tell you, you're only as good as the folks that you're charged of leading. Followers, it's pretty important to study the group to understand the dynamics of how that group works together. So, can't be, my father used to say, you can't really be a good leader until you're a great follower.
So can you give me an example of that in your leadership career where you had somebody that had the potential to be a great leader and yet they really struggled with the followership?
I think we've had it, probably all of us have had it, whether it was in the military or corporately. And I obviously wouldn't present names, but I think you can see those folks generally in your careers, and they're usually very obvious because they for the most part, are standing alone at some point in time in their careers. They don't build a tribe, if you will. Whereas if you move around, whether it's the military or the corporate environment, you start building a tribe of folks that you've led over time. That tribe becomes bigger, thicker. It just does. And those that haven't figured that out are ultimately fighting that solo game. And I don't care who you are, where you are, unless you are, and I haven't met one to this day. If you haven't figured out that you are nothing more than, the front piece of what it is, the unit or the people that you're leading, then the journey is going to be somewhat empty, in my opinion.
And it's funny you talk about it in that way, because I learned early on, I was probably 4 or 5 years out of law school. So here I am, I'm just turning 30. And it was my first responsibility of overseeing and assisting young attorneys. So here we are, we've got a group of 25-year-old brand new law graduates. Their bar cards are still wet and they think that they're the greatest orators in the world. And it was the dynamic of managing the ego that came along with, okay, now that you've made it, and now that you have this responsibility, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And what about this? And I always remember I had a young attorney who graduated from a top 50 law school. Why they were at the state attorney's office making $37,000 a year as a lawyer, I have no clue. But they knew I got it. Leave me alone. Let me do my thing. I have a bar number just like you. And as a criminal prosecutor, I was in the sales business because I was selling incidents that happened and investigative work and the observations of people to a jury who would decide if somebody committed a crime or not. So at its essence, it was people in building quick rapport with strangers. Now, if I were in the business, environment, that would be then selling them the product or the widget. So I watched this attorney time and time again go in front of juries and step on their tie. And they kept on losing, and they would lose, and they would lose, and they would lose. And then they would blame other people because the ego was so conflated. And it was a situation of having to go to that person and say, not in a way that you're here and I need you here, but it is just listen, we're all here for the same good. We all need to row the boat in the same direction, not because you're not valued, but because if you're not on an oar, the boat has less horsepower. And it was sort of that evolution that really taught me that not only did I have to create a space for people to follow, but then as I reported up my chain, practicing what I was teaching and preaching, which was, that can be a really difficult dynamic.
For sure.
Yeah. And they put themselves on an island. That's probably the better way to say it. Ultimately, if you're building strong teams, it's not about just the leader. It's how that team forms. And they have expectations and they hold each other accountable. So the individuals that don't avail themselves of the opportunities to forge those relationships because they think, they know what right looks like, normally, they'll bubble to the surface fairly quick. And sometimes they get away with it. I mean, you've seen them in your career that they'll get rewarded and they move on. But the team ultimately will figure, at some point in time, you're going to culminate. Without that grasp of understanding how important that team experience is and that self-awareness, the line in the sand where you draw that self-awareness piece, they get figured out.
Well, and in my world, they get figured out because they take an inch, and now they want a foot, and now they want a yard. And eventually people get so far out over your skis that you go plummeting down the mountain. And the thing that I love about that analogy is as they're falling down the mountain, the team is sitting there, after their day on the slopes, having a cocktail and a good time because they're working together and there's stability.
And they've probably told them, Ryan, about 5 times, if you keep that up, you're going to fall down the mountain.
And then we're going to laugh at you when you're at the bottom.
Yeah, well, I'm having this picture as you all are bantering back and forth on this ego and also building a team, because I personally got to experience the two of you in a leadership role, leading leaders in a volunteer role. And that's actually what intrigued us. That's one of the places that got us here is I got to observe the two of you leading a very high pressure, high emotion, high stake decision-making process. And I was absolutely blown away by, I've always said that from my experience, if you really want to test your leadership, lead volunteers because they don't have to do it. You talk ego. Oh my goodness. Everybody, oftentimes as a volunteer wants to be at the front of the line and everybody's fighting for position. And it's a very difficult situation to lead. And so watching you all lead in this situation was just magnificent. Mm-hmm. And so, as I was doing that, I was really challenged to answer the question, is leadership born like when you were leading this way? And I saw your skill sets coming out and I saw your passion coming out. And I heard things, Ryan, like I was sitting at the table with you and these men who are volunteers and leaders in their own right, saying to you, Ryan, I would follow you anywhere. And then after dinner, we got back and I saw what Chuck was doing on the back end and, getting people aligned and heading in the same direction. What would you say? What are the skill sets of a leader that would make someone say, I would follow you anywhere?
I think it is empathy. I think it is recognition of the skill set, both positive and negative, that somebody brings. I think it's the willingness to coach people. And honestly, I think it's just being direct and treating people as responsible adults. You said it, I think, great in the volunteer space. So I was the national chair of a collegiate fraternity, men's collegiate fraternity, which sounds a whole bunch of fun and partying and games on the surface, but we're a 250,000 living member organization over the last 125 years with a multi-million-dollar a year budget, trying to set strategic policy that is going to resonate with 18 to 24-year-old men on 240 college campuses. And what's interesting and unique about that dynamic is the board that I was chair of and Chuck was a member of, and Chuck continues to serve on, are a bunch of accomplished people from their individual backgrounds and sectors. But one of the things that I learned was just because you're a good salesman, just because you're a good principal, just because you're a good scientist, engineer, widget maker, whatever, doesn't automatically mean that you're going to be good in every environment. And what was important to me was to deal with people individually and say, I need this skill from you that you excel in to help us here. How do we develop the other parts that aren't translating as much? And I used to ask every board member, how can I make you more successful? Because the reality of it is my term is going to end. And having just turned off a board after 14 years, 60 days ago, it's a dynamic experience. But to me, it was recognizing that everybody brought a value, but not allowing people to rest on their ego or their laurels or their comfort zone, and trying to challenge other people. Because as leader of that organization, I had to make decisions. But the thing that I was surprised the most about is I didn't make nearly as many decisions as I had to, or I expected to, because I had everybody underneath me who were the people who were dealing with the issue and making the decision that I trusted. So to me, the leadership portion was trying to identify the icebergs. And I think that translates across anything. If I'm handling a civil litigation matter and I've got 3 attorneys that I'm working with and I'm the lead attorney, I'm just making sure we don't put it in the ditch. I'm not deciding which witness is called first or which witness is called second. If I'm in the business sector, I'm making sure we don't go bankrupt, not what the color of the straw is. So, and that was a hard lesson for me to learn. It required adjustment sort of mid-course to build that confidence.
But I think one piece that Brian mentioned as well, if you've been in a leadership role, you understand what that crucible can mean to the individual. So the thing that makes that team dynamic work, at least Ryan ran the organization. all of us knew what our roles were and we had expectations. So you park your ego at the door. You understand as a leader, your role as a follower is to make sure that you're reading intent and that you're doing everything you can to shape success for the organization. The guy that has to ultimately bear the accountability for that is not you. It's in this particular instance, Ryan. So being comfortable in your role. Now look, we have disagreements in the end. We'll have really colorful conversations, but when you walk out of the room, you have to own it. If he's the decision maker, and whether you agree with it or not, if he's given, and he always does, gives you the opportunity to voice your opinion, provide feedback, and in the end, this is the decision, then you have to own it, you have to wear it, you have to embrace it, and then you have to go make it work. And I think those folks that have had the experience of sitting in a leadership role are much more attuned to being able to understand the responsibility that comes along with being a great or a good follower.
Well, and that's interesting you bring that up because, and this is just part of the dynamic of our personal relationship, is oftentimes Chuck would come to me because, as you can tell, Chuck is a very structured, principle, matrix.
Say it, old.
Experienced. But
vintage.
Chuck,
so nice.
So I'll give you a perfect example. Chuck was chairing a risk management committee that I had previously chaired and thought I did a pretty decent job with. Chuck came back and he said, "Nope, we got to do this different. Here's an enterprise matrix, and this is a high, medium, low, and this is red, and let's stay in green sectors and not red sectors. And if there's double red sectors, that means damn thing's going to blow up or whatever." And I'm looking at this going, oh my gosh, first of all, did I do it wrong? Because I wasn't in that space, but also sort of being at the top of the optic food chain helped me, because there were a number of times that Chuck would come to me and say, what's the measurable here? And not a, you're doing it wrong, but it was, hey, I see we don't have this. How about we use this? And so that to me was an example of almost simultaneous being a great follower because you're following the message from the top, but being a great leader because the second rung, the B suite, the C suite, those are the ones that are having to put it into practice. Because me being at the top, I just don't have enough visibility to all of those things.
Well, I think it sometimes that's misunderstood, that followership means being silent and just simply following. And the examples you're giving is a good follower challenges, right? Respectfully challenges.
Isn't this like raising kids? Where your 14-year-old comes to you and says, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. And you tell them no, and they're just turned sideways, but they don't appreciate that you're seeing it from all inputs as opposed to just their side. But I think a lot of that is, especially in the volunteer space, because you have people volunteer their time because they are either self-serving and want it on their resume, or they are passionate about the mission, the organization. And that passion in the volunteer uncompensated space can be a quagmire, because they're being motivated by passion and not by principle or not by full aperture. And it's hard. It was hard for me to transition from that narrow focus to, every time I took on more roles, the aperture got wider and wider and wider and wider. And then I couldn't focus in on something fun.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that we need the whole followership. And I think one of the more important things to understand as a follower is, it's okay. You should be comfortable being uncomfortable, but not to a point where you put yourself in a position that you're going to put the organization at risk. So it's the balance of saying, I can challenge, but am I challenging for the sake of challenging, or am I challenging because I think I can make this better?
Right. And
oftentimes those who come ill prepared in a followership role feel comfortable challenging because that is the loudest voice in the room at that point. Generally, if you have smart folks like Ryan around, that gets sniffed out pretty quick. And that builds good organizations, because therein lies that accountability. If you're going to challenge, then there should be context behind it. Why are we challenging it? What's the best idea then? One of the better, I'm sure it's in business and law school, is if you're going to come to me with a problem, at least give me 2 or 3 resolutions, things that we can look at, or at least be honest on the front end and just say, I've got a sticky feeling on this guy.
But you've got to be willing to ask for the perspective.
Absolutely.
And you have to be willing to listen to the response, because I see it a lot where, and I deal with this with clients, I deal with this in dynamics where if you ask for my advice, you're telling me I trust you enough to seek your input. Now, you don't have to agree with me, but if you ask somebody's input and in the first 30 to 45 seconds, you start doing the but or what, in those aspects, that to me just demonstrates somebody who is disingenuous, who is asking because they were trained to ask, but they weren't trained to listen. And, as being in a position of following up and leading down, that to me just completely destroys upper credibility. I mean, just in an instinct.
It also destroys credibility downstream.
Absolutely.
Because it's sniffed out. You know this. When you've been in business a while as well. People will see that. I mean, leadership is not something where you can do in a corner. Neither is good followership. Either one of those. But I would found it in best organizations. I go back to what I said earlier. When you create a good, and we had a very strong culture on the board that Ryan led, it becomes accountable. The group becomes accountable even before the leader enters the room. And that's when you know you've got a good team.
That's right.
And they can hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
And Ryan may walk in and go, what? Nothing. Sit down and go run the show. Just don't worry about it.
Yeah, because it's a culture of being accountable versus holding someone accountable.
Absolutely.
Such
when it
a different
becomes
culture.
you mentioned it before, when it becomes part of the DNA of the organization is that accountability. And then you don't have to say it. Have you ever noticed that people that always focus on accountability, generally they lack accountability? Because it's one of those things that becomes born out of the nature of how good groups develop into great groups, right?
Well, and this to me comes back to your earlier question of learned leadership versus intrinsic leadership, because to me, it's not about you can't train somebody how to be empathetic. You can't train somebody to be open to understanding what others are saying or thinking or feeling. You can either do it or you can't. And you could read all the books in the world and listen to all the lectures in the world about you need to listen to what other people say. Until you're ready to do it or you're just wired to do it, then I don't think you're going to be successful. And to me, part of the concept of leadership is not only recognizing where you can contribute, but also recognizing and having enough humility to say, I could never be a CEO. And, it was a dynamic that I've dealt with in various board positions where everybody wants to be the leader. Everybody wants to be the CEO. Everybody wants to be the president. Everybody wants to be at the top of the food chain and on the 6 o'clock news and all of that. 5% of your soldiers, to use one of your term, actually have the skill set to be the CEO or to back cleanup. But to me, you can be a very effective leader. And I know baseball's something near and dear to your heart. You can be a super effective leader by playing right field, batting seventh, playing your position to the best of your ability, following the direction of your base coach, and not running home when you know you're going to get nailed. But that to me is also being a leader. So the best leaderships in organizations aren't even the top person.
Right.
Oftentimes.
Right.
And by the way, that person went playing right field. At the end of the day, if they win, they're getting a ring.
It's got
That's
a ring.
right.
So be comfortable with
comfortable
being uncomfortable, but understand what your role is. And once you understand your role, don't have an allergy to change. Be willing to. And Ryan mentioned it earlier. Folks that I've always been interested about this whole, this whole concept of born leadership traits versus.
Yeah.
And I'm not smart enough to be able to differentiate the two, to be honest with you. And I'm always uncomfortable saying someone's born with good talent, right? And they can get away with it only so long. So I think all of us have natural abilities. Good leaders are able to reach down into organizations and parse out those things that make the individual good, but also contribute to the organization. And sometimes, as Ryan mentioned, those are hard conversations. When you tell someone you're not going to be a shortstop, you're going to be playing right field or whatever it wants to be. And then the interaction you have with the individuals is largely borne out by the relationship that you've established with them. And if you've built that career trust or whatever, and sometimes in the military, it comes with a history, because you don't have an individual for years and years and years. You have them for a very brief period of time. So, it's almost trust me until I let you down. And that is, you think about the mantle of leadership there, where you have a bunch of people that really don't know you, but all of a sudden, in some instances, you got their life in there. It's absolutely mind-numbing sometimes. So you have to keep yourself on your game. And so Ryan mentioned earlier that whole idea of the great follower and being the teammate, in my mind, should flourish before you ever even get to the point where you start talking about the leader.
So are there skill sets that a leader can work on to become better? For example, I know that we talked about before we pushed record, decision making. I know that's something that you're passionate about. Those are there some skill sets like that people can work on to become leaders or become better leaders?
Yeah, I think there's an art and science. Art becomes something that's a little bit simpler because it's supposed to be just the manifestation of the individual that you are. That's kind of, you study it, but ultimately it's how you in the delivery. The science, I think studying the science of decision making and all, any young leader should always do. There's a concept of decision space. How many times have you met a young man or woman that you come to them and say, I need you to solve this problem for me? And what are they doing? Automatically trying to provide you feedback.
Yeah.
Right. It's like time out. How about take a step back and understand frame of reference? How much time do we have? It's important. Why? Because I need to know how much I can invest in studying the options to the problem. Who owns the decision ultimately, so I can figure out how am I going to deliver? All of these things are what we have to teach young leaders to do, because what do they want to do? They respect Ryan. They want to make sure that Ryan's happy. Right.
Right.
And in that instance, Ryan should be the guy taking a step back going, slow your roll, Bubba. Right. Let's study the art of making a decision. And how many people do that today?
Oh, I mean, tons. And this is where I love discussing with you these topics, because I love how analytical you approach things, because I feel oftentimes with myself, both in a individual contributor and in a leadership position, I have a perception of I got 1,000 knives flying at me. And it's not about looking at what size the knife is. It's seeing it's right here and I better duck or I'm going to take one between the eyes. And I think in the learned sort of skill set position, what resonates with me based on Chuck's comments is reality and perspective. I can learn how to better negotiate. I can learn human dynamics, and I can learn, back when I was a prosecutor, this would be going to interrogation school to learn how to do interrogations of homicide suspects that I would sit in on, or forensic interviews of children, or things like that. There was definitely a science piece to it from a perspective, but I think one of the best skill sets you can learn is to have a mastery of the perspective of what the decision, what are all the possible effects of the decision. And the problem with going to law school, there's positives, but the problem with law school is your brain is completely rewired. And my lawyer brain is something I cannot turn off. And
it's a true statement.
Yeah, I try, and I will tell you, my wife, you are good friends with my wife. My wife is amazing. I know it frustrates her that I'm always in lawyer brain mode, because it could be something as simple as, hey, where are we going to go to dinner? Well, let's go have a steak, but we could also have this, because I'm wired to always think both sides. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think I personally take the concept of sort of reality check and perspective not with the gravity that it deserves, because as my wife will point out, who the heck cares if we eat Chinese or Mexican? We're still having dinner and we're still spending time together. But I think that, especially when you're young or you're getting your first few opportunities, so many things are life or death. Mm. And I think about it, and I'm not quite as old as Chuck, but I'm in my mid 40s, and I only now start to appreciate that I've probably only made 5 or 6 decisions in my life that were purely, legitimately life or death. Now, you can make lots of decisions that'll make your life much more difficult, but they're ones that you can overcome or just take you a longer way to get to where you want to go. Yeah. But I think the other part to it is, and I see this in the law field, is people have this tunnel focus. What do I want to be? So you asked the question to Chuck in the very beginning. When did you realize that you were a leader? I'm pretty sure on Chuck's first day of basic training, he didn't imagine, or the goal wasn't to get exactly to where he was. It was probably not to pass out as he's running 12 miles. But I think the other skill set that you can learn is the need for constant reevaluation. Because if I'm so forward tunnel focused, I'm going to miss these off ramps. And, oftentimes, and I can point to examples where I thought I knew it too much. And because of it, I missed a junction in the road. And it was, God telling me, maybe you should think about this. And me saying, nope, I know what I'm doing. I got to get to this goal. And I think as a leader, that's something that you can work on is patience and perspective. And then all of the other nuts and bolts stuff that this man is so eloquent about, I think comes into play to kind of help you in your toolbox.
If we had to pull the thread on Ryan's talking about self-awareness, as you move in through your career, that takes on a different meaning. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to just take a second, give you a perspective on when you tell someone young to be self-aware, in their head, they take it as a criticism.
Absolutely.
All of a sudden you turn around and go, why do I need to be what am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
Right. And as they move, so when you teach them habits very early on, what you see is those that move through that crucible that are open to the coaching and counseling from their peers and all, they become more adept when they move further in their leadership career, creating those units or formations or companies or whatever. That's the first thing they dive into is developing the individual, because they become over time self-aware that that is the strength in organizations are really focusing on the individual. Because if you know your people and you focus on the things that drive those individuals, not the dollars and cents or the wins and losses, but the things that drive the individual, you're going to create a tighter connection. The connective tissue between the leader and the folks that they're leading becomes tighter. But also, cautionary note, becoming self-aware means you got to open yourself up. But be careful, because in those leadership roles, you will have those out there that are looking for nothing more than an opportunity to try to figure out how to take you down a notch, whether you deserve it or not. Some might say, well, avoid those. No. In my mind, what you do, you're seeking that kind of feedback, is have that person in the second or third chair down from you. Here's the reason why. I had a young man, not a young man, he's the same age as I was. And this was when I was in my Army days. And it didn't matter when it was General Witt, whether or not I said go left, he was going to say go right. If the sky was blue, he'd say it was orange. And it was just his nature. Now, half the time I wanted to choke him, but I kept him close. And this was the reason why. It only took 2 or 3 out of, what does it take if you're playing baseball to get in the Hall of Fame? 300. What happened the other 7 times?
You struck out or you knocked out. Yeah.
So those that isolate those people from their inner circle, they're missing the opportunity, because every once in a while, this young man would come across and say, yeah, but, and I would go, and then I would take a step back and go, oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do.
So how many people can be comfortable having that person sitting, at least 3 people down, so I couldn't reach him without someone's stuff. But I think that's, you see individuals that put people like that in their teams. I think it's a strength. It's an absolute strength.
Well, and that's interesting, because this phrase popped to mind, and I love trashy TV. One of my favorite shows is The Bachelor.
Trashy TV?
Oh my gosh.
Oh, you're talking about reality TV?
Yes, sir. You know what? You and I will watch Bachelor in Paradise, and we'll have just
I watched The Senior Citizen.
Yeah, sorry, my TV has color. But my wife and I joke about all the time, all these people saying, well, I just want them to be vulnerable. So like the word, came to my mind as you were talking about that, though, because to me, I have found that people will align behind me when I am vulnerable and share my thoughts. Because when you have the detractor, the guy sitting in the 4th chair is the one punching him in the ribs and saying, you're an idiot. So to me, although I do see that you need to be careful so as to not blow yourself up. However, from my perspective, and this is just the trial litigator in me, is then you show me you're better. I'm going to tell you who I am. I'm going to tell you why. And I'm going to tell you how, and I'm going to share with you my journey that helps to give you a perspective, because, and especially in the organization we both worked in that was focused on college students, I would have more 18, 19, 20-year-olds coming up to me saying, what you said resonated with me, or I'm going through something similar.
Yeah.
And that also applies in the business sector. And, to me, what reinforced being human and being real and being vulnerable was that if you can resonate with somebody underneath you, now all of a sudden they've built an identity or a connection. And to me, the connection is what pushes things forward. It makes people raise extra money for philanthropy. It makes people put in 2 extra hours off the clock because you and them are in the same fight, even though you're in very different places.
I'm so glad that came up, the connection piece of this and the vulnerability piece, because I think so often leaders minimize the impact of that. And I got to experience that last week. I was doing a growth conference in Canada, and I woke up in the morning. It was my last day, leading this group of people. And I just felt compelled to share my story. Mm-hmm. And when I shared my story, number one, there wasn't a dry eye in the place, which that completely took me aback. And one of the managers that was there, I have worked with this company for 12 years. And she came to me on the first break and just hugged me, tears just streaming down her face. And she said, Wendy, I have never seen you this way. I picture you in a, she called me a couple of names, and that's how she pictures me, and that's okay. And she said, I've never seen you like this. Thank you for that. And then she began to tell me her story. Mm-hmm. By the end of that day, I had a line of people who wanted to share their story with me. And I was just completely taken aback. I'm still getting emails. I still have I have a call tomorrow with someone who wants to share their story with me. And I think sometimes, as leaders, it's easy to kind of try to pull people along instead of being vulnerable and sharing our story. And what you said, Ryan, that's so true. That's what resonates, is the story.
So what I'm interested in is what sounded in you to take that step with a group that you've worked with for years on the last day of
what was the catalyst?
What was the tipping point in the season?
Yeah. So I woke up at 3:00 in the morning, and I actually texted your wife and said, I need you to pray, because I'm not sure, because I just heard this Bible verse in Revelation, we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. And I immediately got down on my knees and went, am I supposed to share my testimony with this group of people? And there was just no question. And so I had a tribe of women who were praying for me, and there was just no doubt that this is where I was supposed to be. And I didn't know if it was going to be healing for me or for them. And it was both.
Well, but it's interesting because it sounds like to me in that situation, you became a follower in following this directive, voice, feeling, intuition. Mm-hmm. And I think it's often the time in talking about these dynamics, you can do something as a leader that has a different purpose or result than the people who are receiving the message. So, and I think that there becomes a certain responsibility to use the positions that you work decades to get, to be able to give testimony, to give guidance, but to also recognize inside yourself, I'm going to do what I think is right. And I don't know how it's going to affect others, but I'm going to also be respectful of others and allow them the space to take from my word, my testimony, my message for their own good. I mean, that to me is just a whole nother level.
Well, I think people are hungry for authenticity. Mm-hmm. I think so often they see leaders as this untouchable, I can't talk to them. I can't relate. I can't. And as soon as they start to see someone as a person who is vulnerable, who is willing to connect, who is authentic, I think I've minimized the power of that.
Well, and I think to a large degree, and I'm not going to be the person on the other end of it saying, yeah, but wait a minute. But yeah, wait a minute. what you have to be careful of too is it's that mask. We used to call it the mask of command. There's a balance. Yeah. So at some point in time, and I think it's awesome because that's you're creating a connect. Listen, whether it's business, whether it's law, this is about human connection. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm doing the role of a leader and I only go so far that I'm only concerned about what it is that you can bring to the organization to benefit the organization, then in my mind, that's not leadership. That's managing.
That's exactly right.
But at the end of the day, when I know Wendy and I know enough about you to know that something's bothering you, then you're invested in the individual. The muscle that's created in the relationship is not about tenure or time. It's about investment. Ryan mentioned it in an earlier comment that he made about how can I make you a better person? And oftentimes you think that's just rote, but it's really not, because if it comes from someone who's genuine, you know it is.
That's right.
And then, by the way, that shouldn't be a public display. That's a personal relationship. So I'm not going to be the person that sits in the group and says, let me tell you what Wendy and I did yesterday. That's not the right answer. Being a leader is a one-on-one relationship, as important as it is a one-on organization relationship.
That's right.
Well, and I think to that point, and so the board that I was chair on at the event that you were at, I was the chairman of an international board of directors, but in our organization, the chair serves many roles, and one of them is ceremonial, figurehead type stuff. And I try to be humble. Most times I think I do a decent job. And one of the hardest things for me was I would come across people and interact with people in the organization who saw me as the figurehead and, would have a hard time talking, or my kids, and you know them very well, would laugh at me because they would come up and say, hey, can we take a picture with you? And here I am. I just came from the pool and I'm in a bathing suit, and these guys are, seeking me out. And I'm just going like, who the hell would want to do that? And it was hard for me to realize that in some of our positions, that person that you have contact with only knows you by the picture on the website.
That's right.
Or only knows you by the news story. And I think sometimes you try so hard to be humble that you devalue the position that you're in to other people. And that to me is a human dynamics piece. And it is so hard to manage. And I it's something to where you just got to fall on your face a couple of times.
That's right.
That's a much better way to say what I was saying when I said, wait a minute.
I get paid to speak by the hour.
So I'm just going to keep writing notes. But no, that's absolutely perfect.
And it's great. I think it's great to be that embodiment in a way that allows you the platform to be authentic. And I think that, part of that leadership development is picking and choosing the times that you need to be part of the crowd.
That's right.
Like, you don't need to be selling copiers every single day. You need to be able to see this person maybe isn't getting the job done. How can I go with them for the day or take a couple of hours and see what they're doing? I had this fascinating opportunity. I was still in government service as a lawyer. And my boss, who was the elected official, came to me and he said, look, we're inefficient. So here we are. We're the largest law firm in Central Florida. We have 178 attorneys, $26 million a year operating budget. We handle 80,000 cases a year, all of this. And my boss said, hey, can you come and create one workflow for 178 attorneys to follow in 80,000 cases in 23 police agencies? So I took 9 months and I followed every single attorney. How do you do this? 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 And then I thought, I've got this. Okay. So I went in my laboratory and had a 20-foot flow chart of the moment a guy had handcuffs put on him to a moment a jury read a verdict. And I rolled it out and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And the people in the office said, well, but what about this? And I can't do this and I can't do this. And it was like coming down off the perch so far that I lost perspective, that I wasn't going to make everybody happy there. And in doing so, sort of devalued the trust and position that I had been given to analyze a problem, make a solution, roll out the solution, and then deal with it afterwards. Yeah. So had I not learned that, I would not have been as equipped to deal with future leadership where I needed to recognize I can show up at the rally, but I don't need to be dancing on the stage, so to speak.
One I used to share with young folks all the time, you'll get a point in your career where you'll hear this conversation. You are paid to fix problems, not to create them.
Yeah.
And so when you get to a particular point where your actions are creating more problems than the time spent solving the problem, chances are, Ryan probably was picked because someone looked at it and said, give it to Ryan, he'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Right? At the end of the day, go figure it out. Tell us what you figured out. You're going to get darts thrown at you. That's human nature.
But that's also being willing to be tenacious and run into the mouth of the lion.
And willing to fail. I mean, both of you talked about lessons that you've learned, failures that you've made. It's not all about winning. And I think sometimes that's the greatest lesson.
But that to me is sort of the difference in the education training space. And I'm not sure how you can effectively teach somebody to fail, because the people that are seeking leadership training are those A-type already.
Yeah.
So it is, how do we create situations to where people can safely fail that aren't mission critical?
Well, and is that part of a leadership skill set, is the willingness to take risk?
It is, but we always temper that with willingness to take reasonable risk, right? It's like he's a hell of a lot better golfer than I would ever think about being. But I'm taking lessons now, and I'm just a couple years older than Ryan. And my golf pro said something I thought made perfect sense. He says, every time you stand over a ball, think about it this way. There's a shot you can make and a shot you could make. Most of the time, sticking with what you can do versus what you could do is going to be the right decision. Maybe be the most boring one, but that's the lessons of leadership, is stay in your lane, do the things that, again, understand what your role is. And I was a high school football coach for a period of time. And I used to I was a quarterbacks coach, much better coach than I ever thought about being as a player. And I would tell young kids, you have to have, a short memory and a deep scrapbook. And that's the game of leadership.
Yeah.
When you're out there, if you get studying every decision you make, then you're going to just get yourself wound around the axle. And you have to be comfortable with, look, failure is a 4-letter word, but it is also, there would not be such a word as fail if there wasn't a word success. It's a natural part of it. We don't want to teach young leaders to embrace failure. That's the dividing line. I'm not looking to fail, but what I do understand is on the journey, there are going to be times when I fall short. You can call it fail, you can call it a misstep, whatever you want to be. The actions to get yourself back up and keep moving on are the same. And so if we don't make it a F word, if we make it a word that we're a bit more comfortable with, but we also tell people you're not being paid to fail, you're being paid to succeed, but the journey will have that along the way.
That's right, which then creates resilience.
Yeah. And if I could give you just a real quick vignette that made this, I remember one time, it wasn't intended to be a compliment. I took it that way to begin with. In the Army, when you're a major, they used to call them Iron Majors, because I'm convinced some of the smartest people in the world are at that major rank, right? And I used to be told all the time, Whit, you were the best major in the Army when you were a lieutenant colonel, because I thought I knew how to do the job all over. And so someone told me, said, look, let me ask you something. What's wrong with the method that this individual is going to apply to solve this problem? I said, well, let me tell you. I said, stop. That's the problem. That you're not allowing that individual to move through that crucible of how they think about a problem. And even if that individual is going to misstep a few times, do you really have to go in and bail them out every single time? In the end, what they want to know is that you're there. You're a backstop for them. And then when they get done and they sit down and you have that conversation about what could I have done better, be careful with that as well, because better's frame of reference. In the end, what did Ryan tell me? I need this done. He didn't tell me how to suck the egg. And no matter how I wanted to apply the art of making a decision or making something happen, I want to absolutely celebrate that this individual accomplished the objective. Park all that. Maybe that's over a beer after I've had a really good relationship with them over a period of time.
Yeah.
Do your job. And oftentimes the part of a leader is to be quiet, to be the backstop, and to stay out in front of them 3 to 4 moves to make sure that you do everything you can to widen that area of maneuver so that individual has the freedom to think themselves through those things. And it's a hard thing to do for those of us that have been through that. And, but I think that in my mind is one of the best opportunities leaders have, is to watch young people develop And you see the look on their face at the end when they come back and you put your arm around them. And all you have is, you did it. Yeah, but but you did it. And then the education of the leadership will come in time. But let's build some success here.
So, and you asked earlier about volunteers and volunteerism and the difficulties and challenges with leadership and volunteer roles. There's also a tremendous opportunity. So I went to law school. I never took a business class. I never took tax class. I hated numbers, wanted nothing to do with it. And 24-year-old law school Ryan figured that you made enough money arguing in court to hire people to crunch your numbers. So I hated it.
Of course you did.
So here I am. We're on our board, and I am nominated and elected to be treasurer, chair of the finance committee. And I go, oh, crap. People are patting me on the back. Congratulations. It's such a great honor. And I'm going, oh, crap. I don't know the first damn thing about budgets and P&Ls and balance sheets and audits. And I'm going, what the hell do I do? So my volunteer role, and that was a 2-year position. And it was at a time right before COVID, but, a prosperous time, but things were still moving at a great pace. I go, okay, how do I do this? And had it not been for that position where I was forced to learn the skill set. Now my space, my tacking space was this volunteer thing to where I got elected. I guess nobody else wanted to do it, and they can't really fire me because I'm doing it for free. So I felt more comfortable using that as a learning lab. And I now just finished on a professional committee where I just stepped down as treasurer. And now, since I've been through that process in a volunteer role, I'm able to now at least know more what I'm doing about, well, did we think about this and we think about this and how's the accounting work and allocate all of that stuff that 24-year-old me thought, I would never want anything to do with. But I would not have had that ability had I not had volunteer opportunity to have the space to do it. So I think to a large extent, it's taking advantage of opportunities to be able to learn in that type of environment.
Yeah. We could record forever. You all have so many experiences and so much that I just think our listeners could draw from. So I just want to thank you so much for the time, for your wisdom, for making me better today, for making our listeners better today. So as we wrap up, Chuck, what's one thing that you would say to our listeners, something that, a new leader who's up and coming and they want to be in a leadership role, they're just not sure how to get there. What would you say to them? I think
trust your instincts, number one. People don't walk into opportunities with a thought, most of them, with a thought on the mind, what can I do to screw this up today? Right?
Yep.
And so understand that the crucible that you're going to move through to become a young leader will have the highs and lows. But if you surround yourself with good, capable people, if you're honest, if you have integrity, if you're a communicator, and if you can prove yourself to be resilient over time, stick to it. When times get tough, take a deep breath. Find humor. Humor can be the great equalizer in a lot of events. And Ryan and I can tell you stories about how we can get to critical situations and the ability for someone to take a step back and remember that this is all relative. And leadership is an opportunity. Think of it that way. It's not intended to be, check the block. It's an opportunity. And if you approach it as an opportunity or a gift, I think it becomes much more rewarding as you move through it.
Mm-hmm. Ryan, what about you?
I can't follow that.
Ditto.
Ask me what I want for dinner. I'll be better at that. I think it is, I think to complement that, which is very well spoken, I think it is be ambitious, but always keep a foot in where you came from. Because it takes so long to build those layers of trust. It takes so long to prove yourself. It's like our kids go to elementary school and then they graduate 5th grade and now they're in a middle school with 3 elementary schools. Then they graduate 8th grade and now they're in a high school with 8 middle schools, and now they're in a college.
Yeah.
It's as you become more successful, the pool just gets bigger. And it's really easy to lose your footing and allow temporary success to pollute your mind. And when you're making those decisions for thousands or having an impact on tens of thousands, it's the person all the way down at the bottom of the totem pole is the one who ultimately is going to receive the work product of your leadership and your direction. And I think if you can keep even just a toe down there to know what it still feels like, I think that guides your decision making.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much for being here. Thank you for flying in to do this. And thank you both for your time. And I just want to say it's been awesome. And I look forward to the next time.
Great. Thanks.
Awesome.
So thank you.
Thanks for listening to Unleash with Wendy Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.